Today, we're holding a hearing to discuss urgent federal funding needs for communities that are harmed by the recent natural disasters. Before we get started, I do want to acknowledge briefly, this is the first hearing we've had since the election. It is clear some things will look different next year, but one thing will not change, and it is my commitment to working with Senator Collins to keep doing the important work of this committee in a bipartisan manner, despite any disruptions thrown our way. There is too much at stake for families back home for any of us to throw up our hands. We also still have to wrap up our FY25 bills, so I remain committed to working together to complete that process as quickly as possible in a manner consistent with the Senate's bipartisan bills, which we have all put so much effort into. So back to the subject at hand, we will have two panels of witnesses today. First, Senators Ossoff and Tillis will speak about the challenges their states are facing. Then we will hear from top federal officials at the Department of Transportation, the Small Business Administration, Department of Agriculture, Department of Housing and Urban Development, and the Federal Emergency Management Agency. We also recently received an updated emergency supplemental request from the White House, which offers a helpful roadmap, but it is just the start. We know it will take full time to fully assess the needs of our communities impacted by the hurricanes and other natural disasters and the resources required to recover. So I hope we can take what we hear today and act swiftly in a bipartisan way to provide relief. After all, there is a long history of members coming together quickly in the wake of tragedy. Every one of us knows our states have needed help after disasters before, and we will certainly need help again. When disaster strikes, it should never matter who's in the White House, who's in the majority, which governor is asking for support, or how anyone voted in an election or on a last bill. As I've said before, you don't argue over whether to put out a fire, you don't debate how much water or to use or how many people to save. You roll up your sleeves, you get to work, and you get help out the door as much as needed, as fast as possible. Right now, there are a lot of people in our country needing help, and yet this is one of the longest times in my memory that we've gone without Congress providing disaster funding. That's unacceptable. It is well past time we get aid out to the many people in need after the many disasters we have faced over the past 2 years. We've seen devastating wildfires, including in my home state of Washington, and the utter destruction in Maui. We've seen a typhoon hit Guam last year, which is still in recovery. We've seen historic flooding in Vermont and deadly tornadoes in several of our states. There's the ongoing effort to rebuild after the Key Bridge collapse in Baltimore. And of course, the two hurricanes that recently tore through the South with catastrophic effect. It is clear that Hurricane Milton and Hurricane Helene were devastating, but the full extent of the damage is still coming into focus. And while we can see the road to recovery more clearly, we can also see it is a long one and it will take serious federal support. There are still communities without power and clean drinking water. There are miles and miles of roads and bridges that are still washed away. Families are wondering how they'll be able to return home if their house is gone. Farmers are wondering how they can recover from the loss of crops and poultry and more. Business owners are wondering how they will ever reopen their doors, and more than that, how their entire city or community will rebuild, especially those communities that thrived on tourism. People are desperate for answers and help and hope, and they are looking to Congress for action. We cannot let them down. Not now, not ever. That's why it's so important we come together to pass a bipartisan supplemental that meets these challenges. We need to replenish FEMA's Disaster Relief Fund. Right now, the backbone of our disaster response is running on fumes. We need more funding for the Department of Transportation's Emergency Relief Program. In 2013, when Washington State had a bridge collapse, that program was critical to our recovery, and it is critical now for rebuilding and reopening the Key Bridge, not to mention the roads that were washed out by Helene. We also need funding for HUD's Community Development Block Grant Disaster Recovery Program, which will help families get a roof back over their heads. Some communities have been waiting nearly 2 years to know whether any HUD disaster funding is coming their way. The needs are piling up, and the longer we wait to rebuild housing, the more rents will stay high for everyone in those communities, whether you lost your home or not. We also need funding at the Department of Agriculture to support our farmers who lost a season's crop. And of course, we must replenish the Small Business Administration's disaster loan program. SBA loans make it possible for renters and homeowners and businesses to get started on things like rebuilding and reopening and mold remediation. President Biden and members on both sides of the aisle have worked tirelessly to get people the help they need. And this committee is going to do everything it can to make sure we fulfill our obligations to get money out the door and get support to our communities. But funds are exhausted, and the SBA backlog is growing, over 60,000 applications already. I really appreciate the work of Senator Tillis and Senator Warner to craft a bipartisan bill on this. It was incredibly frustrating to see their bill blocked by a senator last week. But we are not giving up. We need to get this done. We need to get it done soon. I want to underscore that. Delay is not harmless. It carries its own cost, one that families and communities will be forced to bear for years. Businesses shuttered, jobs lost, family farms bankrupt, houses overtaken by water damage and mold, communities unable to return and rebuild and reopen, families forced to abandon the houses and communities they love because they can't afford to stay, not to mention people forced by desperation and necessity to take out predatory and high-interest loans. Every day we don't act, the costs grow. And in one final point, in times of crisis, it is actively harmful when political leaders spread disinformation and mistruths about relief efforts. The blatant lies we saw repeated this past fall, particularly in the aftermath of Hurricane Helene, do nothing to help. It undercuts trust in FEMA, and importantly, it discourages people from getting the help they are otherwise eligible for. I know and I trust that members of this committee, Republican and Democrat, are committed to getting accurate information out there to help as many as people as possible. So I urge everyone to listen closely to this discussion today and let the weight of the work ahead really sink in. I hope that after this discussion, we will be able to work together in a quick, bipartisan way to draft and pass a supplemental that